So in the response to our last video on Kant's ethics, we actually got only relatively few responses actually on Kant, and more about Derek Chauvin and the case of his trial, which I spoke about at the end of the video, and even more about wokeism. I quote two of these comments. One is by Luis Soto. "I feel as though there is yet to be a proper analysis of wokeism." And another is by Rob Wickline, who says, "I'd love to hear a more extended analysis of what you think about the problematic nature of wokeism, as you say." And today we're doing just that. The comments on wokeism, even though it was a video on Kant, show how relevant the topic is today. I think wokeism today has Western society in its grip. We're seeing it basically everywhere, in media, in daily life. It defines what people love and hate. For instance, in North America, the basic political schism and social schism that we have right now, the divide between those who are with Trump and those who are against Trump, between the conservatives and the progressives, is kind of similar to the lines of those in favor and those against wokeism. To mention just one example of how it affects our everyday life from my own experience, in academia, particularly in North America, if you apply for a job nowadays, you're asked to hand in a diversity statement, right? This statement is actually not supposed to kind of critically assess diversity or maybe even question the necessity of such a statement. That wouldn't get you the job. The function of the diversity statement is basically that it's a kind of an exercise in woke language. And despite the huge impact on everyday life, I think the notion is still largely misunderstood, and particularly by very famous thinkers, just like Jordan Peterson, who's attached the Marxist postmodernist label to wokeism. And that's something that I'd like to criticize in this video and to suggest an alternative understanding of what wokeism is. So it is, I think, and others have said this as well, it functions basically as a new form of religion, and more specifically as a new kind of civil religion, which from North America and Western Europe is spreading throughout the globe. Let's start with a preliminary definition of wokeism, and we can just look at what Wikipedia says about it. Wikipedia basically defines wokeism as a public discourse, and I quote now, "concerning racial inequalities and other social disparities, such as discrimination against the LGBTQ community, women, immigrants, and other marginalized populations." What this definition, as correct as it is, though, misses is, I think, a central aspect of wokeism, namely that it is based on identity politics. So identity politics is basically an approach to politics as struggle for the empowerment of personal identity. And it's typically based on exactly those aspects that were mentioned by Wikipedia, such as race, gender, sexual orientation, and religion as well. Now, identity politics is therefore, so to speak, the predecessor of wokeism. And identity politics has been around since the 1970s. And there has been a relatively strong critique of identity politics in the past decade. I'd just like to point to one example of this, a book by the center-leftist liberal intellectual Mark Lilia, who in 2017 published The Once and Future Liberal After Identity Politics. So in 2017, Lilia said basically identity politics is over. But I think it's very obvious that identity politics is far from over. It evolved into something new, into something even more intense and more widespread. So I would say wokeism is the comeback of identity politics with a vengeance. So to give another first definition of wokeism, we can say that wokeism is a renewed and intensified form of identity politics that is now present in all sectors of society, at least in the West: politics, media, advertising, sports, art, education, and even military. Rather than just giving a theoretical description of what wokeism is, we can look at an example. And there was recently the CIA posted a very interesting recruiting video that was full of wokeism, and actually the video got a lot of critical reactions to it. I hope you will look at it. It features a woman who calls herself intersectional cisgender millennial. She's obviously feminist. She's wearing a feminist t-shirt. She's non-white. She talks a lot about her immigrant background. She talks about her anxiety disorder. She's not slim. And then she finishes up all this by saying that she's unapologetically me, and I think that's an interesting phrase. So basically, it's a claim for personal identity recognition. And she is an exemplary person combining all these woke identity markers, and that's obviously meant to show that the CIA embraces diversity. Now, as mentioned, there are lots of critical reactions to this CIA video, and viewers point out several paradoxes. The first one I'd like to quote is by Patrick Perry, who says, "She says she's not a box-checking exercise while checking all of the boxes of her identity." And this really shows one paradox in wokeness, namely that these personal identity markers are not merely personal. They are somehow supplied already in the discourse, and they only pertain to several identity features, as I mentioned, race, gender, and so forth. So, for instance, my red hair probably would not count for a claim to be unapologetically me. A second point is mentioned by Mr. Talldude24, who writes in his comment on the CIA recruiting video, "So now they'll be torturing people while wearing shirts that portray female empowerment and Black Lives Matter. So it's good now." So this points to the fact that wokeism does some sort of moral whitewashing. It moralizes that which is amoral or sometimes even immoral, right? So here we see in the CIA ad a commercially produced kind of moral profiling of the institution or organization, which, for instance, is known for torturing people. The first question I want to address about wokeism is the question, is wokeism leftist? And as mentioned, prominent critics of wokeism, just as Jordan Peterson or Donald Trump for that matter, come from a conservative or alt-right position, and they're staunchly at least anti-leftist. So that wokeism is leftist is a claim that has been successfully made by the right, and I want to challenge that claim. It led to the unfortunate effect that people feel uncomfortable with criticizing wokeism. They don't even like the word because they think it's too negative and they think it's used by rightist people. And that was also evident in one of the comments on our video by Minch333, who said, "I do hope this channel doesn't fall down the reactionary grifter rabbit hole," when I was hinting at a critique of wokeism. So if you say something critical about wokeism, that already kind of puts you at least potentially into a sort of rightist corner. And again, that's something I want to strongly dispute today. Nevertheless, technically, I think we can probably say that wokeism is somehow left. Because as I said at the beginning, if you look at the political division, left and right, as it exists nowadays in North America and in Europe, then obviously the people on the left are kind of closer to wokeism, and the people on the right are more against wokeism. So it does correspond to the distinction between left and right in the actual political arena nowadays, at least in the West. However, and this is the important point I want to make, the meaning of what is left has fundamentally changed with wokeism. So wokeism is somehow a left that is no longer left, a sort of a post-left. To summarize this very, very briefly, traditionally, when the terminology left and right was used to make a basic political distinction, namely in the French Revolution, the term left, or the notion of left, indicated those who were more strongly Republican, whereas the notion of right indicated those who were more friendly towards monarchy or aristocracy. So it had to do with a basic political or constitutional division. Now, that changed throughout the 19th and 20th century when, with the rise of Marxism, it became more a socio-economic designation. So simply put, the left was closer to Marxism and communism. It was more critical of capitalism, and it took on working class causes, whereas the right was in favor of capitalism, liberal market, and often staunchly anti-communist. So the notion of leftism changed from a politically Republican-focused idea towards a more class-oriented socio-economic idea. And now we see a third shift, where leftism with identity politics and with wokeism is no longer primarily political, nor even primarily economic. Instead, as the term identity politics says, it has become identity-oriented. Right? It's about, to use again the word of the woman in the CIA commercial, it's about being unapologetically me. So it's about such things as language use, personal pronouns, about personal sexuality, and other things associated with the capacity to be unapologetically oneself. Now, why is wokeism, that is no longer primarily about constitutional issues and neither about socioeconomic issues, but about personal identity, why is this not leftist in a traditional sense? Well, first of all, as Lilia has said, it is hyper-individualist rather than communitarian. And similar things, similar criticisms have been made by other liberal, central leftist thinkers, like, for instance, Kwame Appiah in his book 2018, The Lies That Bind, Rethinking Identity, Creed, Country, Color, Class, Culture. So they all point out that there is a strong individualistic element rather than a communitarian element to it. So that is, of course, not really traditionally left. Then secondly, and this is a critique from the left that I more strongly agree with, is that it sidelines class issues and it sidelines a struggle against capitalism. And this criticism against identity politics has been made by the most famous leftist public intellectuals like Noam Chomsky or Slavoj Žižek. And it has also been made by some people that I've been referring to in previous videos, Walter Ben Michaels, for instance, and Adolf Reed Jr., who has called identity politics, and implicitly thereby also wokeism, as the left wing of neoliberalism. And I think this fact that wokeism is more neoliberal than traditionally leftist is also reflected in a phenomenon that I also mentioned in previous videos, namely the sidelining of actually leftist politicians like Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders by their own parties. And they've been replaced by more woke candidates who are at the same time less left. So identity politics and wokeism is about personal identity affirmation. It's about being unapologetically me. So in this way, it is left in a new sense, less left than the left used to be, or post-left. It is more about creating identity profiles than about struggling for a different kind of state or economy. Now, a second, more specific question directly related to this is wokeism cultural Marxism? Which again is something that Jordan Peterson has said multiple times. And it's also been adopted by people like Trump and others. So they succeeded, and as I said, in wrongly labeling wokeism as hard left or cultural Marxism. But if it is cultural, simply put, then it is not Marxism. Cultural Marxism is an oxymoron. Marxism is not about culture struggle, it's about class struggle. Marxism has never been about the cultural superstructure, but always about the socio-economic base structure, the means of production, which then support or build the foundation for a culture. So a cultural Marxism is a contradiction in terms. And we can see that wokeism is by no means Marxist in how it has been deeply embedded and made supportive of capitalism, right? There are now basically almost every brand has become a woke brand. It's a major marketing tool. And marketing and advertising is at the heart of capitalism, right? And it's even used for the military-industrial complex, a CIA video. So I think it's pretty obvious that it is not the case that the left has, with wokeism, subverted the CIA and turned it into a leftist organization, but rather that wokeism has presented capitalism and the political and military institutions supporting it, like the CIA, with an opportunity to what we could call culturally appropriate and thereby subvert leftist ideas. So in this second question then, again referring to Peterson, is wokeism postmodernist? And this claim has not only been made by Jordan Peterson, but also by a book, Cynical Theories, which was recommended by a reader to me. And I think this claim is equally, if not even more, problematic or actually false. So postmodernism, if you allow the pun, is in essence non-essentialist. It's really subverting any idea of something like an essential identity, which is so much central to identity politics and also wokeism. Postmodernism views identity as socially constructed, as fluid, and not as something that really inherently constitutes someone. Moreover, postmodernism avoids simple binaries that are so present in wokeism. It hardly subscribes to any unconditional values. There is no universal hierarchy of values. There's a strong non-normative tendency in postmodernism, and wokeism is extremely normative. And then thirdly, there is no meta-narrative in postmodernism. There is, in particular, no redemption narrative. There is a multiplicity of incommensurable perspectives, paradoxes, and postmodernism is essentially non-ideological, whereas wokeism is strongly redemptive and constitutes basically the big meta-narrative of our time. So I think really that wokeism and postmodernism are radically different from one another, but it has to be admitted that a certain postmodernist jargon has been mixed into or again appropriated by wokeism. And that's why it's often falsely taken to be postmodernist. So why use the term wokeism? It's a negative term and it's mostly used by people on the right. And again, one viewer pointed this out. I'm quoting here Frank McManus, who says, I just Googled wokeism. All the top results were from right-wing American sources. And yet, even though my critique of wokeism is not from the right, I do like the term for one particular reason. Because wokeism is the only of these terms, unlike identity politics or unlike political correctness, unlike virtue signaling, it has very strong religious connotations, right? It connotes awakening. So, and this shows what I think is really at the heart of wokeism, that it's basically a sort of civil religious movement. It's a kind of a secular awakening, somehow in the tradition of earlier great awakenings in American culture. And thereby actually the term wokeism, against the intentions of the people on the right who use it, implies a critique of religion. And again, that's why I do like the term. Now, my central argument is that today's wokeism is the civil religion of the West, and it combines two elements: traditional US-American civil religion and German guilt pride. I'm going to discuss American civil religion first and then German guilt pride second. There's an excellent essay on what American civil religion is. It's written by Robert Bellah in 1967. It's called Civil Religion in America. Bella takes the term civil religion from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and like Rousseau, conceives of it as a shared spiritual, political, moral vision and ideology that has kind of a national foundational impact. He rightly says that American civil religion is grounded in Christianity, but then also in the largely secular ideas that we find in such crucial foundational texts as the Declaration of Independence of the United States. Bella, at the beginning of the article, quotes someone else, S.M. Lipset, to make an important point. So I quote this quote here. He says, "At least since the early 19th century, civil religion has been predominantly activistic, moralistic, and social, rather than contemplative, theological, or innerly spiritual." So a civil religion basically represents a shift from strictly theological, let's say, transcendent values to activist, moralistic, and social movement. Now, what does American civil religion consist in? Well, it has strong elements of individualism, a focus on liberty and private property as well, a sense of equality, pursuit of happiness, individual happiness and also collective happiness, progress, prosperity, a sort of pragmatic optimism. Obama's famous slogan, "Yes, we can," also embodies it. And it combines it with a sense of national destiny, some sort of missionary zeal that is supposed to guide the whole world, with the idea of the United States as some form of beacon of liberty, whose role it is to liberate everyone, basically. Bella pointed out that this American civil religion comes in different forms, and he saw one as positive and one as negative. So it can, and it did, equally inform something like the civil rights movements of the 1960s and 70s, as well as it did inform the Vietnam War, which also supposed, to liberate the Vietnamese people. So there are clearly different denominations of American civil religion. One that is more republic, one that is more democratic, one that's more progressive, one that's more conservative, one that's more left, one that's more right. And Bella was strongly sympathizing with the more progressive, more leftist denomination, and was actually strongly arguing against the Vietnam War. And he tried to use civil religion to argue against the Vietnam War. And equally today, we can say generally the American civil religion as a whole equally informs the Black Lives Matter movement and the war on terror. However, there are two different denominations within this civil religion, and the one is more strongly behind Black Lives Matter, and the other one, the more conservative one, is more behind the war on terror. I think it's pretty obvious that this activist, individualistic, post-leftist American civil religion, as represented by the civil rights movement and by feminism, is what gave rise to identity politics in the USA in the 1970s, which in turn then later on gave rise to wokeism. So American civil religion, and particularly its progressive post-leftist denomination, are one decisive element that later on constituted wokeism. Now let's move to the second element, German guilt pride. Of course, the situation in Germany was very different from the situation in the United States after the Second World War, right? Germany lost the war. It was exposed as having committed genocide, and the country ended up divided. And the two different Germanys after the war reacted very differently to their fascist past. Communist Germany defined itself as anti-fascist. The government said, we had nothing to do with the fascists, we were victims. Our leaders were themselves persecuted by the Nazis. And we actually liberated Germany from fascism. We are by no means continuing the fascist regime. We are anti-fascists. Now, in West Germany, this was different. Western Germany somehow acknowledged that it was a successor state of Nazi Germany, but it also, of course, acknowledged that Nazi Germany was basically just an enormous crime. So Western Germany adopted the following strategy. The aim was to basically admit a guilt, but at the same time trying to pay off the debt. And so there was the idea that Germany can somehow work towards a Schlussstrich, a final line, when all the debt has been paid off. Now, after 1989, after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, after German reunification and the end of the Cold War, Germany got reunited, and then obviously those two strategies didn't really work anymore. And then a new strategy was developed. And this strategy, I think, is perfectly represented by what now became basically the symbol of the new Germany in the center of Berlin, the new capital of the reunified Germany, namely the Holocaust Memorial. And the Holocaust Memorial represents this new idea that, yes, we accept our guilt, but it is a guilt that can never be paid off. It will never go away. It's a guilt that we inherited from the previous generation and that we also internalize. So we define ourselves by admitting this immense guilt, and we take on basically everlasting responsibility for it. And this is what the Holocaust Memorial at the center of Berlin symbolizes. Yet, at the same time, comes a miraculous transformation. Namely, by admitting the most serious guilt that to such an extent no one has ever yet admitted, by accepting that one is guilty of such an enormous crime that no one ever accepted guilt for, Germany somehow becomes, in a paradoxical way, morally superior again. Because our guilt is greater than everyone else, and our admission of guilt is greater than everyone else's, we become also somehow more morally elevated than anyone else. And we can be proud of being capable of accepting such an enormous guilt. So guilt pride is this paradoxical redemption and moral self-elevation through guilt admission. Now let's address the question what wokeism really is. It is neither cultural Marxism, nor is it a postmodernist leftism. At heart, it represents the incorporation of a German-style guilt pride into identity politics that took place after 1989, after the breakdown of communism, after the fall of the Soviet Union, after the end of the Cold War. And thereby, by the way, ironically, despite being against such things as white supremacy, it is actually deeply white, right? It's rooted in Christianity, it's rooted in Western individualism, it's rooted very much in the Western historical experience regarding slavery, colonialism, the Holocaust, and so forth. And that's why, by the way, the Chinese call it Baizuo, white left. So from the Chinese perspective, it is clearly seen and identified as a Western and thereby white phenomenon. And it consists basically in some form of taking the moral high ground through intense guilt admission with respect to such things as the Holocaust, or in the American case, slavery. There is at the same time a very strong focus on identity, right? Today, identity is very much curated through the curation of profiles, and I talk about length at this in the You and Your Profile book, which just recently came out. So it serves the function of creating an identity, both for individuals as well as for organizations. CIA, for instance, is an organization. So it is an identity politics that creates identity in the form of profiles. Now, what are profiles? Profiles are publicly projected images that once you get positive feedback on them, you can identify with and you can internalize. And we did some other videos on this as well with regard to the philosophy channel, Philosophy Tube. So this brings us now to an updated and more complex definition of what wokeism is. Wokeism is a civil religion combining American individualistic liberalism with guilt pride. It is based on and comes from identity politics and focuses on the creation of identity profiles. It is now penetrating all sectors of society in the West: politics, media, advertising, sports, arts, education, military, and so forth. Now, what is religious about wokeism? First, a strong emphasis on guilt and redemption. Similar to Christianity, there's an emphasis on confessing guilt and the hope of redemption through this confession. Secondly, very strong dogmatism, certain taboos of public speech and thought. Humor, for instance, becomes more and more suspicious. And there are punitive tendencies, as I pointed out with respect to the Derek Chauvin trial. Basically, all these phenomena that we can nowadays call or associate with so-called cancel culture. Thirdly, there is a divisive moralism to it, right? Jesus Christ famously says in the Bible, "Who's not for me is against me." They're somewhat similar to wokeism, right? There is not much room for neutral ground. There is no fence sitting, right? You're either for it or against it, and that creates a very binary good-bad distinction with not much middle ground between us and them. So it's basically manifesting itself in this increasingly hostile schism between traditional American civil religion, Trumpism without guilt pride, and wokeism with guilt pride. And we see a very strong symbolic struggle about this as well. Like there was this conflict about statues and monuments in the US where the woke people wanted to take down the monuments, and Trump was saying this cannot be done. So the wokists wanted to admit and ascribe guilt, whereas Trumpism wanted to basically not allow any form of guilt into American civil religion. Then, fourthly, there's a strong ritualistic conformity pressure. And that's what the notion of virtue signaling points to. But that's also what we see. I gave this example at the beginning of the video when it comes to diversity statements when you apply for a job in academia, right? You have to demonstrate that you are willing to conform. So there is some form of systemic hypocrisy here, right? We have all the woke celebrities famously, and also the CIA video, which are basically easily regarded as forced statements, and therefore their credibility is questioned because they seem just to be a sort of, as I said, ritualistic conformity. Fifth, there is woke washing of capitalism and imperialism, again, very much represented through the CIA ad. And that is the very same function that Christianity had in the 19th century, for instance, and earlier during imperialism, right? The ships that brought soldiers and took the wealth of the colonies also brought Bibles with them, right? And similarly today, CIA doesn't embrace Christianity anymore, but it embraces wokeism. So it serves a moralistic profile creation of a capitalist and still imperialist institutions. And number five, there's a strong personal internalization that becomes possible through wokeism, just like in religions. It enables a certain fundamentalism, it enables zealotry. So For instance, one friend once told me, and this was a remarkable statement, he said that one of his family members had become a reborn Christian, and this somehow destroyed the family because the person developed such a strong zealotry. And in a similar way, I think we see this phenomenon that wokeism also, of course not in everyone, but in some, breeds fundamentalism, breeds zealotry, and leads to what we could probably call a personal over-internalization. And then 6, of course it helps the creation of a public identity. Some form of civil religious affiliation becomes possible. And that's on the one hand similar to traditional religions, where you could also define your identity through publicly adopting a faith or publicly professing a faith. However, this now happens, of course, in a very different environment, and as I like to say, it happens on the basis of prophilicity, profile-based identity. So instead of whatever having monks and nuns who, create an identity by going to a monastery and reading texts from the Bible, now you demonstrate your affiliation with wokeness, for instance, by being a YouTuber and by producing social media communication. Now, still we may ask, isn't wokeism about all the right things? Isn't it all great? I mean, and people like Bella and Rousseau also thought that civil religion is basically a very good thing if it's done right. So we could say, yeah, wokeism is perfect. It creates public enthusiasm for justice, equality, human rights. But well, I mean, Christianity also could be considered as having been all great. After all, it created enthusiasm for love and peace. However, with Christianity in hindsight, we also know that it created a lot of problems, wars, even genocide, fundamentalism, and so forth. I think it's important to see that just as Christianity did not invent love and peace, wokeism also did not invent justice and equality. I think it can be said that Christianity somehow appropriated and to a certain extent even monopolized love and peace, and thereby imposed a sort of dogmatic belief system onto it, which led not only but also to war and fanaticism. And these problems with Christianity have been pointed out by many people, just to mention a few, Nietzsche in the 19th century and very recently Sam Harris. And to point out these problems, of course, of Christianity, for instance, is not to argue against love and peace, but against what could be called the corruption of love and peace through some form of religious appropriation. And similarly, I guess, to point out problems with wokeism as a civil religion is, of course, not to argue against justice and equality, but against their civil religious appropriation and even monopolization. So, to conclude, I think maybe in these times of a new awakening in form of wokeism, we might, again, be in need of a second enlightenment, as I pointed out in an earlier video, right? And we might remember Kant's critique of philosophy as the maidservant of theology, and ask of philosophy that it doesn't become the maidservant of wokeism. Its job is not to abolish wokeism, but to critically shed light on it, to question it, so that it does not turn into a fundamentalist frenzy.